Today, I want to talk about a railroad that's very dear and close to me because I grew up in Felton. First 19 years of my life were in Felton, and I moved back there for about 4 years in the 2010s. It's really it's a very close thing to me. And the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, I'm just going to spoil the ending right now, is also possibly the most important of the three talks we're giving in November because, in a sense, it still exists today in the form of the Santa Cruz Beach Train, this officially Roaring Camps Santa Cruz Pacific and Santa Cruz Big Trees and Pacific Railway. That railroad follows most of the route of the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, which I think is amazing. 150 years of railroading on that line. And it's just, it's a beautiful ride, 8 miles from Felton to the Santa Cruz beach. And it goes through some of the most beautiful scenery, some of the most beautiful redwood forests that you'll get in the whole world. So I've always loved this railroad. And when I first started researching, about 14 years ago now, local railroads, while the South Pacific Coast Railroad was the one that first caught my interest, the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad almost immediately became a focus because the two of them are entwined and their combined history really makes for a fascinating story. And yeah, just to pitch my book, my first book, Santa Cruz Trains, blurry. Well, there it is. My first book, Santa Cruz Trains, Railroads of the Santa Cruz Mountains, uh, still very popular. I sell quite a few copies each year, and it really tells the story in detail. So if you're interested in a little bit more of a deep dive into the railroad stations along this route, I recommend that you check that out. But for today, we're going to be talking about a very short period of time, 5 years officially. Technically, it goes about 12 years, but the time that the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad was the railroad that really created the town of Felton and created the San Lorenzo Valley industries and made them into something that was actually profitable. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is here is Felton in 1863. At the time, it was Rancho Zayante. Isaac Graham had the property. In fact, I believe he died that year, just right before, after around this photo was taken, or this lithograph was taken. And it was what you'd expect a mountain Mexican rancho to be. Its primary industries were lumber with a little bit of ranching with cattle and leather, but not as much as on the coast. It's primarily was a remote logging settlement, and that's what Isaac Graham focused on. And that's really what most people focused on into the 1870s. But that wasn't its only industry. Not long after California became a state, gold was discovered in the community. And it's a strange thing. You don't really think about Felton as a gold rush town, but we did just have an exhibit at the SLV Museum that talked all about that. So it was a gold rush town. It wasn't quite the same gold rush that attracted people to the Sierra foothills, but it was still a gold rush. And it's really what brought the first real populations of people to the area. And when they got there, they realized there's not much gold here, but there's two resources they could exploit. There's lumber, which I'd already discussed, and there was also limestone. While they were doing all this gold prospecting, and just in general, they discovered that there's quite a lot of limestone, and around Felton in particular. And so quickly, some limestone kilns popped up on Bull Creek, on Bennett Creek, and then up on the hill, which is where Henry Cowell really based his operations. At the time, it was Davis and I'm blanking on the name. Isaac Davis and his partner, and then eventually it was Cal. And so they really focused heavily on the limestone industry, and that does play a little bit of a factor later on in the story. There was two other little industries in the area. In 1864, the California Powder Works opened up near the entrance of the valley, near Santa Cruz. That's where Paradise Park is today. And it became the first black and white powder and smokeless powder plant on the West Coast. And that was developed, it was supposed to be developed during the Civil War as kind of like a protection in case the West Coast somehow got attacked or the Civil War came to the West Coast. It never really did, but it was kind of supposed to be for protection. But once the Civil War wrapped up, they decided let's just keep making the black powder. And so that was one of the big industries. And there's this very small one that people don't really know about, but where the Mount Herman plant is on Graham Hill Road, kind of at the intersection of Graham Hill Road and East Zayante Road, there was a fuse plant, and it literally just made fuses. And as you'd expect, it eventually burned down because fuses. But that was also a small industry that was well regarded until it burned down. And like many industries at the time, it wasn't insured. So once it went away, it never came back. But so you had these things that were drawing people to Felton, to the San Lorenzo Valley, at a time when people were really interested in moving to Santa Cruz and the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so, yeah, we'll move on to just a heads up. This will give you a little bit more of a photographic tour than I usually do. So fewer text slides, more photo slides. So I may not be exactly talking about the stuff that's in the photos, but I will be talking roughly about what they're illustrating. And in some cases, the photographs like this one are not actually from the 1870s, which is kind of our main topic period, but they're illustrative of the type of activity that were going on at that time. So here's a couple, yeah. So here's a few of them. This is felling trees on Gold Gulch, just south of Felton. This is one of our few photographs we have of actual mining operations, although this is a much later mine, the Stripling mine, which is also south of Felton. And then here we have some charcoal retorts at the California Powder Works with the man posing next to them, and some piles of looks like split stuff being used for firewood probably. And then the Holmes lime works in Felton. We'll get back to that one in a little bit. So we have some major milestones here. 1864 is when the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad was completed. That predates the Transcontinental Railroad by 5 years. So it's something worth noting. And that railroad really linked the west side of the Bay Area together, and really suddenly made people aware that railroads are going to be a thing. They're going to be here to stay, and it's something we're going to want to connect to eventually, especially Santa Cruz County. Santa Cruz County at the time was the second biggest port in California outside of the San Francisco Bay. And so we had a lot of industries going on. We already had 2 wharves plus quite a few smaller wharves and landings all along the coastline. People wanted to get stuff from Santa Cruz County to the Bay Area quickly. And so one of the options, people were thinking, let's build a railroad up the San Lorenzo Valley. That way we can ship mostly lumber out from the port over at the Santa Cruz Beach. There was also a more ambitious plan, like maybe we should start connecting to San Francisco directly. So then this rivalry started up between, should we go south along the coast and then inland through Pajaro Gap to Gilroy, or should we go straight through the mountains, probably to a point somewhere in San Mateo County, like Redwood City? And so these 2 competing sides kind of were pushing for what should we do. And the thing is, Santa Cruz didn't have a lot of money at the time, so that was kind of one of the driving negatives out of the whole situation. And so there were some letters in 1866. We had rival letters in the newspaper, and it got quite heated for a little bit, discussing what's going to happen with the different, who's going to fund what. Is the city and the county going to help with any of the funding? And yeah, so once that happened, so the next thing that we had to deal with is the obstacles. So at this point, the San Lorenzo Valley was probably considered the easier of the options. It's a shorter route. It's only about 8 miles to get to Felton. If you're going a little bit farther, it does cost more because you're going to be going up to Boulder Creek, which is another 6-7 miles. And if you're going to headwaters of the San Lorenzo River, it's about 16 miles. So it is building up a little bit. But so the obstacles that you have to deal with if you're trying to get from Santa Cruz to Felton are, you have the 5-mile San Lorenzo Gorge. It's a very steep, very bendy, precarious, granite, rubbly gorge. And by this point, it's already been, some of the timber in that gorge has already been harvested. And so it's also prone to landslides. And so you're having this, you have this big obstacle right pretty much as soon as you get into the valley. Right after you get past the California Powder Works, you're starting to deal with this gorge. But you also have the problem of how are you going to get the materials to Felton to build the railroad from that direction? Because the only thing that's really open at this point in time is Graham Hill Road. There is no road yet built. What would become Highway 9, the Bennett Toll Road, that was not yet open. That would open up in 1868. And so how are you going to afford all this? And how are you going to surmount these obstacles? Just to give you an idea, the population of the county in 1860 was less than 5,000, and the population in 1870 was 8,743 people. So we're not talking about huge populations, and you got to tax these people, you got to get donations, you got to get subscribers. You need outside help, pretty much. You're not going to be able to fund it by yourself. And so these are kind of the major obstacles that we're dealing with here. Here's just one of the only sketches we have of San Lorenzo Gorge before the railroad. And this is a little bit more idyllic, but you can definitely see the obstacle in the way. There's a sheer cliffside there. And while that is a little stylized, it's not too much. That pretty much is how bad it was. And so this is the type of stuff that people are having to overcome. So one of the first things that we're going to do, got to found a railroad. So the first thing is the San Lorenzo Railroad Company. This railroad, got some key dates for you there. It was incorporated June 20th, 1867. It was supposed to be 15 miles long. It was trying to get up to Kings Creek. So very much lumber focused. It's not trying to get out of the valley. It just wants to get to the larger redwood trees and other useful trees up deep in the valley. They were guessing it was going to be about $150,000. That actually was up. It originally was incorporated for 100, and they had to bump it up. But interestingly, it was financed almost entirely by Santa Cruz investors, and they made a good run for it. They actually got started on this. This is the only failed project in the entire county that they've made a good amount of progress into getting it done. So from from May 1868, they started construction south from Felton, and they made it several miles. But eventually, somewhere in the depths of Davis and Cowell's property, the limestone magnates decided they've had enough. The railroad was doing something that was perfectly legal at the time. They were going through people's property, cutting down trees, selling those trees or chopping them down and using them for railroad ties and fence for trestles and whatever else they needed to use it for. But they were cutting someone else's property and cutting right through somebody else's land without any consultation, without any compensation. And eventually Davis and Cowell, they just kind of had enough of it. And so they filed an injunction against the company, and all construction halted. So they had about 3 months, maybe 4 months of good construction when everything just stopped. And there are aspects of this. If you check on LiDAR, you can actually see some parts of the grading that still exists in Henry Cowell State Park today. So it wasn't complete. Like they were making good progress. One notable thing is this railroad was going to run much closer to the water line of the San Lorenzo River. So it was pretty much just going to be right above the high flood line. And that was considered a good thing because it meant even though it would require possibly more bridges, it would make it so it didn't require so many cuts and turns. It was going to be more of a straight line, and it also could have avoided some of the more rugged, dangerous areas that would have required blasting and cutting grades into hillsides. So to fast forward a little bit, just to wrap up the story of the San Lorenzo Railroad, twice the railroad actually succeeded in getting the case thrown out, and twice Davis and Cowell petitioned to get it restarted. They may have even resumed construction briefly. It's not entirely clear from the newspaper sources, which is really the only people talking about this. But yeah, so in January 1870, the trial was postponed and it was delayed almost 4 years. So from this point on, the railroad pretty much is just stuck. But can't let this stop progress. So we have another one, slightly different name, San Lorenzo Valley Railroad. And this was another local initiative sponsored this time by Frederick Keene. You've probably heard of Frederick Keene. He is everywhere in Santa Cruz history. He was a very influential entrepreneur. He paid for lots of stuff. He has his names on a lot of stuff. And one of the things he really liked to do was found railroads. And he did several of them. I think there's 5 that he's an investor on. And so this was incorporated in March 16th, 1871. So we're about a year after the other railroad had completely stalled and it was stuck in the courts. 16-mile long, a narrow gauge railroad from Santa Cruz to Boulder Creek. I don't know why it's 16 miles long in this case, and it was 15 miles to Kings Creek, which is farther. I can't explain it. It's possible that he planned for it to go up part of Kings Creek. That was something that happened multiple times. He was a little bit more realistic with the cost plus inflation, so he's saying it's going to cost about 200 grand. And the other investor, though, is notable. It's George Treat. He was a major lumber guy in Felton. His camp was probably somewhere in the vicinity of the toll house, so that's actually important for later. And yeah, so I missed 2 of the most fun things. I apologize. So going back to the previous one, so in May 1868, the town of Felton was actually founded to serve as the northern terminus for the San Lorenzo Railroad. And so, copying the same pattern, in January 1872, the town of Boulder Creek, which at the time was known as Alcorns, after John Alcorn, the owner of the property, was established as the northern terminus of the San Lorenzo Valley Railroad. So that's 2 railroads that, for the record, never were built, establishing towns that still exist today. And so if you're ever looking for a reason why railroads are important to local history, that right there is your evidence you need. Unfortunately, the San Lorenzo Valley Railroad didn't even last, or lasted barely a year. It was dissolved around October 1872, and it's because nobody was willing to fund this railroad other than Keene, Treat, and a couple of their friends, because there's already a railroad that's already partially funded that's just stuck in the courts. And at the time, everybody thought, okay, well, there's a really good chance we're going to win this case because we've already won it twice, so what's the problem? So to conclude the story of both of these failed ventures, in February 1874, the San Lorenzo Railroad, the earlier entity, it finally went to trial against Davis and Cowell, and they lost. And they lost big time, and it completely changed how all railroads, all eminent domain in California would ever function again. And it made it so if you take somebody else's land for a public good, you have to compensate them fairly. It seems logical, but at the time, that wasn't necessarily considered a logical thing. And so with that ruling, both railroads pretty much had no chance. And so the San Lorenzo Railroad finally dissolved. It had no funds left. It couldn't pay this eminent domain costs. It couldn't do anything. So we're back at square one. 1874, we have no railroad, no projects. We have 2 towns that have barely any roads connected to them. So what do we need next? We need some outside investment. The county, Santa Cruz County, they're out of funds. They can't do this anymore. So we have this interesting new idea. Well, how about instead of a railroad, why don't we do a flume? Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the flume because Lisa's talking about the flume next week. So I'm just going to hit the highlights that are important for this story. So it was incorporated August 26, 1874. So we're about 7 months after the previous venture failed, officially. This time we're talking about a 20-mile long V-style flume from Santa Cruz to headwaters of the San Lorenzo River. Again, it's not actually 20 miles, so measurements are relative. At this point in time, it's not even clear how well the backwoods of Boulder Creek were surveyed, so that could be why there's so many differences. The funding, though, it's Santa Clara Valley Lumbermen, and they're putting a lot of money for this project. 500 grand. I mean, $500,000 at this time. That's a lot of money for pretty much getting lumber out. So it seems like a good idea. They're gonna start in spring 1875. They start constructing from a mill that's north of Boulder Creek, a couple miles, and they were done with the flume in November 1875. But why is it we never hear about a flume in Santa Cruz? Because you think this would be a major thing in our history, and it comes down to a simple fact. that there's not enough sources of water south of Felton. Now, anybody who knows the geography south of Felton, besides the gorge, which is its own problem, there's only really one major creek south of there, and that's Gold Gulch, which is not very far south of there. You have a couple smaller feeders like Eagle Creek, but they're not enough to actually be providing a substantial amount of water. And so, because of this, they had this problem that they needed to get that last 8 mile stretch dealt with, and they couldn't use the flume because the flume would be out of water by the time it reached Santa Cruz. And so we finally get to the start of the story, I suppose, the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. So Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, it was incorporated November 9th, 1874, and it was an 8 mile narrow gauge railroad. I spoke about this in another talk, but the concept of narrow gauge railroads was actually a very new idea. It was only in 1871 that the idea was brought to California, and because of that, it was kind of this it was a bit untested because it can make sharper turns, but it can't carry as much load. It seems like it was a bit more of a risk, but the benefit was it was much cheaper than a standard gauge railroad. So you can see they were only financing $100,000 for this railroad. It's the same people that ran the flume. Also, because of Cal and Davis, they were forced to compromise for this eminent domain situation. Cal and Davis wanted to get something out of it. And so what they got out of it is the railroad would be closer to them. And they were at the UC campus, today's UC Santa Cruz campus. So they wanted to be as close to that as they could be, which is still quite a ways away, but it's down the hill. It's down a very steep hill. And Cal and Davis weren't even sure if they'd really need the service, but they figured if they're going to have a railroad nearby, let's get them close. But the problem is that sacrificed that close to the water level mentality that was the plan with the San Lorenzo Railroad. And so you have this railroad that now has to deal with the gorge directly, where before they kind of had found ways around it. And yeah, so construction begins September 1875, and we cut to the end, October 13th, 1875 is when it opened. So it did succeed, and they got built in less than a year. So good job them. These are some of the obstacles they had to deal with, though. 24 bridges. Some of these are very small bridges. Some of them are extremely long bridges. The longest bridge, which we have no photographs of, is actually the one that went alongside Poganip. It went all the way from the top of the hill of Poganip all the way to pretty much where Highway 1 now crosses the railroad tracks. That was a trestle originally. It's now a fill, and you wouldn't even realize it because it's been leveled and the grade's been lessened so much over the years that you wouldn't even realize that was a fill. But not only was it a fill, it was a very steep one and very dangerous. We had a short tunnel. The tunnel went through the Hog's Back, perilous hillsides, awkward arrangements in Santa Cruz. Beach Hill has its own problem, and a wharf. So show you some photos of studies. So this is one of my favorite photographs, mostly because it has a puppy in it. This is one of the trains actually parked at what they called at the time Coon Gulch, which is the tightest part of the right-of-way through San Lorenzo Gorge. So you can see, I mean, there's a rock right there. Like this thing, look how steep and rocky those hillsides are. Imagine landslides coming down from that. And we get a lot of rain in the winter, at least historically we did. And so we'd have all these rocks and stuff every single winter falling on the tracks. This is another view of pretty much the same area. You can see the rock to the right. And this is a long lumber train going through there. And you can see a couple of the bridges as well. One of the more substantial bridges is that one kind of to the right, which is actually a truss bridge. There are very few truss bridges that are attested to on this line, but this one ended up being a truss bridge here just to provide a little extra protection. I suspect it also protected in case a landslide happened, it wouldn't just knock the bridge out of commission. Just a little bit further down the line there, more rock slidey areas. A little bit further still. This is getting a little bit better, but you can still see how steep it is. You can see kind of the trestle here. It's decent, but it's still a little bit crude for the time. They were working on budget. They didn't really have passenger service in mind, even though they did offer it. And you can see the river over to the left there. Also another puppy right in the middle. This is the only sketch we have of what was called the Rincon or Hogsback Tunnel. It was a tunnel that went through. If you've driven on Highway 9, which I assume most of you have, going to Santa Cruz, right before you hit the grade crossing where the tracks cross the road, you'll see that the road goes up just a little bit before it goes back down between kind of the mountain bike area. And that's the top of the Hogsback. The Hogsback's this little jetty that shoots out. In fact, there's a reason why this rancho is called Rancho Rincon, is there's a ring in the river that goes around the Hogsback. So it's this big outlet of granite. And so rather than daylight it, which happened later, they decided to drill a tunnel through it. So it's a fairly small tunnel. So one of the problems that also impacted the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad from early on is the fact that the river flooded seasonally. I already mentioned that we had problems with landslides, but we also had problems just with general river flooding. So that did impact the entire valley in many ways, including in Felton. And so this is a little bit later, but a photo of Sycamore Grove, which is that little first curve when you turn in up Highway 9 from Santa Cruz, that first curve, which unfortunately has been kind of a homeless encampment repeatedly over the last several years. That this used to be a little campsite there. And so moving on to the rolling stock, i.e. the trains, the locomotives, the cars. The railroad purchased two H.K. Porter steam locomotives, which they really lazily named the Santa Cruz and the Felton. The Felton had a lot longer life in Santa Cruz County. And so it ended up being nicknamed the Dinky. And that was a later aspect of the fact that it was a small locomotive compared to the later South Pacific Coast and Southern Pacific locomotives, which were large. And so it was small. So it was dinky. This photo here shows you the Santa Cruz, which is the slightly older of the two. They were bought at about the same time, but the Santa Cruz arrived first and was used during construction. The number one way you can tell the difference is the smokestack. You have this, I guess it's kind of a Y-shaped smokestack with the Santa Cruz, where you have a more traditional diamond flume fluke style with the Felton. So this is the Felton. Also notable in these two photographs is the cars. So in this first one with the Santa Cruz, which is stopped on that little trestle, the truss bridge in Coon Gulch. This is the first class passenger car, which was distinct because it featured windows. It had windows, which seems like a weird thing to brag about, but first class got windows. Second class, which is this car behind the Felton, did not have windows. And so between the two of those, that was their entirety of their passenger cars. If they had any large excursions that required additional ones, they'd grab some flat cars used for the lumber and stick some benches on it. And that was pretty standard practice at the time. This is, I'm going to come back to this flume exchange in just a minute, but this photo is great because it also is the only photo that shows both locomotives. So you can see the Felton on the right and the Santa Cruz, a little harder to see, but on the left. And then on the left side, left stereograph here, you can actually see on the far left, you can also see the station or the freight shed that was in Felton. So this was obviously a promo shot. You've got a bunch of people on top of the flume wearing their top hats and looking very fancy. And this was a glamour shot. So a couple other things. The steep grade between what was called Summit, the top of the grade, and Santa Cruz required them to sometimes do something called shuttling, which is literally just dropping off some cars and taking a smaller load down, then going back up and grabbing the next one. That usually would just be going to Santa Cruz because they were usually flat cars going back up, but occasionally they did have to do it both directions. There was actually, I take it back. I do talk about the flume right here. I'm looking ahead in my notes. The flume here is where they did the major exchange. And so the lumber, and it was a lumber flume, not a logging flume. They were full cut planks of lumber. would reach this point, which is the end of the flume, and then it would dump the lumber on either side of the flume, which would then be loaded onto the waiting flat cars, the waiting trains. Now, again, this isn't the best image of actual operations because you can see the right train has a boxcar attached, which is probably holding lime barrels. And on the left side, there's a passenger car attached. Not great for picking up lumber. That being said, they did almost exclusively use mixed trains except for excursions, which would mean you'd have passenger and freight running simultaneously on the same train. So while this is probably a promotional shot, this isn't entirely unusual on how they do things. Okay, so the next, pretty much the rest of this talk, I'm just going to look at the stations along the way. I feel like stations are the thing that people, in a sense, like the most because it's the thing that's most recognizable. It's why my books are largely about stations. It's what people experience today when they visit a place and they want to know what was here before. Well, here's the histories of the stations. Yeah. So in Felton, so we have some early photos of Felton. These may actually predate the flume. Actually, no, this doesn't predate the flume because these are from the same thing. So these are from the mid to late 1870s. And so this is the kind of main stretch of buildings right at the Highway 9 Graham Hill Road intersection in Felton. You can see the flume in the background here. That's why I remembered the date. And you can see there's some buildings on the other side of the street also. And so it was a town. I mean, it had buildings, it had commercial businesses. It's not, in a weird way, too different from today. It's just much smaller. I focused really tightly along that little intersection between Graham Hill, Highway 9, and Felton Empire. This is the only photo we have of the depot, the passenger depot at Old Felton, and it's called Old Felton to differentiate it from New Felton, which was across the river, where you can still see it. Old Felton Station, New Felton Station is the one that's at Roaring Camp that you can see from Graham Hill Road. So Old Felton Station, this is the Santa Cruz in front of it. It's dressed up for some occasion. Not sure what. We've never really been able to figure out. It could be the opening of the line, but actually it can't be because it has a passenger car. So yeah, I don't know what the event is. It may have just been an excursion. You can see the first class passenger car with its windows reflecting, and you can see just the top of an eave. And that little top of an eave is all we actually have of the building itself. We have the dimensions of the building, but we don't actually know what it looks like. This is an alternate photo of the flume yard. This is just showing, this is taken the same day, but from a slightly different point in the day. You can still see the Santa Cruz on the left there, but you can't see anything on the right. You can kind of make out that there may be some lumber cars behind the passenger car, but you can really see in good detail to the left the actual freight barn or freight warehouse. And so that's where things like lime barrels would be stored while they're waiting to be shipped. Fuses, I assume those would be boxed, so boxes or packs of fuses would be stored there, waiting to be shipped. And it had a spur next to it, so you could load stuff directly onto flat cars and box cars. And for the record, I don't know how many box cars they had or how many flat cars. You kind of just get those and add to them as you need them. This is the H.T. Holmes Lime Works. This is from the Felton, coming up from what is today Heen Street, Heen Road, Heen Street, from Felton, kind of behind the lamented Rite Aid. And the kilns here are actually still in place behind people's properties, the stone kilns. So you can see one of those to the left. Those are still in people's backyards today. But the rest of the facility obviously has been demolished. I've got another photo. This is it with the Felton, already up in its South Pacific Coast livery at this point in time, picking up. Actually, it looks like it's probably picking up firewood. So it was another thing that the kilns would do. They'd have a lot of firewood. It could be dropping it off, but that's a tender. So unclear what's happening here. But you can see lime over to the left, big rocks of lime. And then, yeah, so that was the main thing that was happening in Felton at the time. Is you have a spur that goes over to the Holmes lime kiln, and you have the flume exchange. So a little bit to the south, we have what's kind of an unofficial stop, but it definitely was a place that they did stop, especially excursion trains, which is Big Trees. Now, Big Trees at the time was owned by the Welch family. Didn't have rail service because the railroad didn't go through its property yet. So the way that you got there was you forded the river. And so you would stop at a spot kind of behind the toll house. They have old Big Trees Road, I believe, still goes down there to Cotillion Gardens. And yeah, you would walk down to either a crossing where a wagon would take you like this, or during the summer months, they'd have a swing bridge. And so this swing bridge got put up every year and then was taken down before the floods. And so that's how you got into Big Trees. And then here's just some photos from roughly around the same time. You have the Big Trees Hotel, taken by Romanzo Wood in 1877. You have the postcard tree at the Welch Grove. This is a teeny bit later, but Teddy Roosevelt famously killed this practice when he visited in 1903 and thought it was atrocious to see all these postcards on trees. Quite a few of the trees actually had postcards. And so that practice ended, but it had been running clearly for several decades by that point. So further down the line, I've skipped the Coon Gulch stuff because we already kind of covered that. There was no tunnel at Coon Gulch at the time, so there really wasn't much else other than just a precarious hillside. But if you kept going, this was the compromise for Davis and Cowell. They got a little station up at the summit, which was convenient because the railroad ended up needing a station here anyway. This is where they would stop and decouple cars so they could do shuttling if they needed to. This photo is from a little bit later. It's actually unclear if Cowell and Davis used this spur at all during the Santa Cruz and Felton days, or if they were just kind of future planning for themselves. But yeah, so this is the earliest photo and really the only photo we have of the original station. In later years, they ended up putting a small lime kiln operation here. Actually, it wasn't that small. It was a mid-sized lime kiln right here on the track. So then they didn't have to ship anything. They'd bring down the quarried stone to this point, and then they could directly load the product onto trains. But at this time, what they'd do is they'd pick up lime kiln barrels, and then they drop them back off when they're done. So that's why there's piles of empty barrels to the left there. All right, just a little bit farther. These are a little bit morbid photos for anybody who knows about the incident. But in May 1880, on the inaugural run of the South Pacific Coast Railroad along this line, there was a deadly accident. And so for the benefit of history, they took several stereographs of the accident site. And so it provides us a good idea of what this area looked like at the time. And so this is the grade crossing where today Highway 9 crosses the railroad tracks. You can even see a wagon to the left. So this is just after the crossing. This is pretty much taken from the crossing because it kind of swings away and then comes back. And so you can see this rugged terrain. You can see the road right there. And then this is a view just a little bit further on. You can actually see what's today Highway 9 to the left of that man standing on the bridge. Originally, Highway 9 went under the bridge twice, and you can still see that today when you go on Highway 9. When you see the bridge, look to your right, and you can actually see the little access road behind it, and that is the old route of the road. And so you can see off in the distance here, though, the California Powder Works. Back when there weren't as many trees, it was a beautiful view down at the Powder Works. And then, yeah, here's another one. This is just a teeny bit further down the line from the bridge, but still, you can see the Powder Works down there. And then one more time, a little bit further still more Powder Works down there. Actually, this may be from the side of the bridge. It's a little hard to, no, there's no road. Yeah, so this is further down. And so how the Powder Works is they actually already had a narrow gauge railroad operating within the Powder Works. So that was very convenient to the Santa Cruz and Felton. It was a very small little operation, and they realized that it was to avoid sparks. They were having problems with some of with the risk of explosions. And so within the Powder Works, they'd move things around, explosive goods, around via rail cars. But they were horse or mule led. There was no locomotives down there. And so when the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad came in, they immediately saw the potential. And so they built a switchback up to the grade. There's two switches. One of them would have crossed Highway 9, and then the other one goes up through what's now a couple resident. It's a It's a little bit of a back road, but the switchback actually still exists as a access road for locals. And just some photos of inside the Powder Works. These are a little bit later, so they probably wasn't quite this built up at the time. The Powder Works was only about 10 years old at the time that the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad started. So once we get out of the mountains, we encountered the other weird problem of the city of Santa Cruz denied the railroad a permit to run locomotives down Pacific Avenue. And so because of this, they had to actually run the cars the last 2 miles or a mile and a half using horses or mules or occasionally oxen possibly, and they had to do it at night mostly. So again, we don't really have photographs of this, and it actually only happened for about a year. But at the same time, that meant that Mission Street, or the Mission Street intersection where Pacific Avenue kind of starts, was the terminus for locomotive traffic, which means it also was a good place for passengers to get on. And so passengers would get on at this hotel. That's kind of the big hotel to the right, not the one in the back. So to the right, you have this 3-story hotel with a mansard roof, and the trains would stop right next to it to pick up passengers. And then they'd start going north from there. That also means that at this time, there was probably a turntable and a freight shed over on the north side of Mission Hill, what we call the Potrero today. It would have been over there, and that's where all the maintenance and where the locomotives could be turned. And so what ended up happening is this was not a good situation. And so in 1876, they pretty much had planned this from the beginning as soon as the city council said they weren't going to allow it. So they started building a tunnel through Mission Hill. It was completed in early 1876. And so that bypassed the whole problem. And so from that point on, it went down Chestnut Street, which ended up being a little bit of a hassle because already the Santa Cruz Railroad, which runs to Watsonville, had its station just outside this tunnel pretty much. And so Chestnut Street at its time had 2 narrow gauge railroads running its entire length. And they only split and in fact crossed each other just before Neary Lagoon. So this tunnel, there's only 2 photos of this tunnel from its narrow gauge days. And you can even see from the ties that they already are using larger ties, which is how I know I can date this to about 1900. They're starting to replace the smaller ties with bigger ties at this time. The only other photo we have, I'm not going to show because it's of the South Pacific Coast Railroad, and it's a little misleading, so I decided to leave that one out. But this is a good illustration. So once you get down closer to the beach, one of the things that you're going to find is the Centennial Flour Mill, which was near the end of Pacific Avenue, right before it made its turn through the Beach Hill Cut. And this is a great photograph because it shows the mill after it's already abandoned. You can see broken windows all over the place. The mill didn't last for very long. You can see a wagon load of lumber with stacks of lumber to the left. Those stacks of lumber, I believe, are from either the Olive and Foster Mill or the Grover and Company Mill. And then you can see to the right 2 Pacific Avenue horse cars going in opposite directions, which meant that there was a passing lane there. You can't really see the right side lane, but you can see the horse and the driver. So I love this photo. It's just a great illustration of how busy it was right at the bottom of Pacific Avenue. And then so once you get through the Beach Hill Cut, and I keep calling it the Beach Hill Cut because when you take Pacific Avenue through Beach Hill to get to the beach, that is a cut. That didn't exist before the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad built their railroad. That was an actual continuous hill. And so it was only when the railroad arrived that happened. Before then, the only cut between the hill was the Neary Lagoon Creek outlet, which the Santa Cruz Railroad had already pretty much monopolized. And so everything got shifted over here. And the railroad actually went through that cut where Pacific Avenue now goes today. And so you can see in this photo, the Santa Cruz with that smokestack in front of its depot. So this is the depot that's at the beach. It's pretty much facing directly towards the wharves. Once rail service went this far, this is where people would get off to catch to go to the beach for the bathhouses and anything else that they want to do there. Oh, and also you can actually see to the right, that building to the right is the steamship office. So people could go straight over there to book a passage on a steamship if they needed to. And so the wharves themselves, there were two at the time, and neither of them were really good for placement wise for where the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad wanted to go. So you have this third option. And so they built one right between the two of them. This is the only construction photo we have. You can see the Long Branch bathhouses. You can already see the railroad tracks going in front of it. Underneath the Powder Works Wharf, which is the one in the distance, that would be the Santa Cruz Railroad's tracks. And you can see in the background the Douglas House, which later became the Sea Beach Hotel. This is just shortly afterwards. You can see looks like both of the passenger cars, although the one on the left seems to be being led by a horse for some reason. But they're just sitting there. That's a saloon over to the left. And then, oh, I said it was a Pacific Avenue horse car. I'm not sure if that's actually true. That doesn't look like a horse car. One interesting thing is that the Powder Works had its own wharf, which was that one further in the distance. And so an option ended up being to merge or to connect the two. And so in 1877, they built this little snaking wharf that went from the railroad wharf over to the Powder Works wharf. It was an interesting idea, and it seemed to work for a few years. It allowed steamships to go to either wharf to pick up goods. And that was convenient because you really didn't want black powder just sitting around for too long. It was a dangerous risk. And so it allowed pretty much powder to go out on the first opportunity. And that lasted until 1882, which is when they demolished the Powder Works Wharf, so they didn't need the connection anymore. And this just gives you a really nice visual of what that looked like. This is the whole waterfront, and you can see the Powder Works Wharf connected to the railroad wharf with that little S-shaped wharf. And actually, you can see the shed for the warehouse for the railroad, kind of just near the foot of the wharf and just back a little bit, almost in the middle of that cut. All right, so moving on from this, one weird thing that came out of this railroad is the Pacific Avenue Street Railroad. And it is part of the story. It was incorporated on October 11th, 1876. And it was actually a requirement that this Santa Cruz city put on the railroad. They said, once you stop using the Pacific Avenue track, we want you to sign over that right away to a company to run a streetcar line on. And so it's just a 3-mile horse car line. It was extended out to the San Lorenzo River, and it used the tracks from the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad from pretty much the bottom of Mission and Pacific Avenue, which was called the Lower Plaza at the time, to the beach. It was financed $100,000. I don't know if it actually needed that much. It was mostly for the extension and to pay for the horse cars. And they had quite a few. They had at least 8 horse cars from the numbers I counted. The railroad was the original directors. But James P. Pierce, who pretty much owned the town of Ben Lomond, which at this point was called Pacific Mills, James Pierce kind of he was one of the investors, and he slowly took over until he owned the company outright, and then he sold it later on. The line was called the Yellow Line to differentiate it from the Red Line, which was the city railroad owned by Heen that ran along the Santa Cruz Railroad's tracks. And just to add some little closure on this railroad, it did expand in the 1880s. The Pacific Avenue Street Railroad expanded out to Mission Street and Laurel Street. And eventually in 1892, it was sold to Santa Cruz, Garfield Park, and Capitola Electric Railway, which electrified it and standard gauged it eventually. So it had a pretty good run. It lasted much longer than Santa Cruz and Felton did. These are just some photos. This is it near the end of the line and the Lower Plaza. This is it kind of making the curve and going up the street. And here's one near the end. This one's interesting too, because if you look just to the left of it, you'll see those long structures. That's actually the car barns for the Pacific Avenue Street Railroad, where the cars went to get repaired and stored overnight. If you look closely just above the car, you can actually see where the track kind of has a hook across the sidewalk there. And so that's where the cars would be stored overnight. And then it went all the way to the beach. So here's a picture of one of them on its own little track next to the main. At this point, it would be the Southern Pacific tracks at the beach. All right. And I can't finish the story of the Santa Cruz and Felton without telling its very half-hearted attempt to expand. So, November 8th, 1876, the Felton and San Lorenzo Railroad was incorporated. This was planned to be a 15-mile-long narrow gauge railroad that would go to the headwaters of the San Lorenzo River. Its goal was probably to replace the flume if its goal was legitimate. It had a lot of money financed for it, $500,000, and it was owned by the railroad, so it was financed by the railroad. There were reasons why this was a good idea. Among other things, the flume was already having a lot of problems. It was having capacity issues. It couldn't really handle all the increased capacity because quite a few lumber firms were trying to use it. It couldn't operate for a large part of the year because there wasn't enough water to supply water for the flume. It was constantly having problems, so they were constantly having to do repairs and maintenance. And even though it was only a few years old, parts of it were already showing signs that it may fall apart. So again, costly repairs. And then there was that big transloading facility that they had in Felton where you'd have to load it onto railroad cars. So it made a lot of sense. Like, let's expand this further into the mountains and just get rid of the need for the flume. So not only was it going to be 15 miles long, but it also had a planned 7-mile branch up Boulder Creek and a 10-mile branch up Bear Creek. Sorry, reverse. 7 miles Bear Creek, 10 miles Boulder Creek. And that's really kind of bold of them. No railroad ever accomplished those. And so that would have really tapped the full breadth of the headwaters of the San Lorenzo River, like its most profitable timber tracks. And it's possible that the Bear Creek one could have been extended further to Big Basin. So there's a lot of optimism with the idea behind this. But it probably was just a scam. Not a scam, but a ruse. The thing is that lumber is not that profitable. People think, oh, the lumber industry must have made so much money. It actually wasn't that profitable. It's almost like groceries. Like, they were constantly playing the market. They were constantly trying to pay their bills. And so having a lot of investment in a future thing is a lot more that you're trying to compensate for. So it seems unlikely they were really planning to do this. And it probably was actually just an attempt to head off a buyout by the South Pacific Coast Railroad. So the South Pacific Coast Railroad, it was incorporated March 20th, 1876. So was about 8 months before the the Felton and San Lorenzo Railroad. The plan was a 55-mile long narrow gauge railroad from Dumbarton Point to Santa Cruz. And the actual railroad was much longer. It ended up going all the way up to Alameda and Oakland. But that first chunk was interesting because there really wasn't a way to do their route without the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. They had $1 million invested, and they were backed by James G. Fair, who was a Comstock load millionaire. And they had a lot of funding from San Francisco and Santa Clara elite. But so, yeah, the main thing is they needed to control the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad for this to work, because otherwise they'd have to build their own through San Lorenzo Gorge. And San Lorenzo Gorge barely could handle one railroad. Building a second one is just ridiculous, and everybody knew it. And so in spring 1879, Alfred E. Davis, who was one of James Fair's lackeys. He was officially the president of the South Pacific Coast Railroad, but he wasn't the majority shareholder. He bought, possibly personally, the majority share of the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. So there was a lot of negotiations. It wasn't clear if it was ever going to happen, and speculation even just a few months earlier had pretty much said like they're going to build their own line. So clearly there's this bargaining going behind closed doors. So once they did that, the fate of the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad was pretty much done. They took over the line, made several improvements, and then just to jump ahead a little bit, on May 21st, 1887, all of the railroads owned by South Pacific Coast Railroad were consolidated to create the South Pacific Coast Railway, which was then promptly leased to the Southern Pacific Railroad July 1st. And that pretty much right there, that's the end of the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad as an independent existence, even though it really stopped being independent from 1879. Some of the things that they did during this time, which are still felt today, is Felton Junction, which is the section just south of the big bridge that goes over the San Lorenzo River in Felton. So the old branch from this point into Felton to Old Felton was classified as the Old Felton branch, and many years later it was abandoned. And a little bypass was made next to the covered bridge. If you can still see the concrete foundations for that bridge next to the covered bridge, and that actually is what brought, after 1908, that's what brought trains into Old Felton to be able to go to the Holmes lime kiln facility, which still ran until the 30s. Other things, they added a new tunnel in Coon Gulch to avoid a really dangerous turn. The turn was known to cause problems with the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. South Pacific Coast wanted to be much more efficient, so they lessened every curve they possibly could. The wharves I already mentioned were demolished. They did finally replace most of the flume in 1885 with the Felton and Pescadero Railroad, which that was built in 1885. A little bit of the flume lasted for a few more years north of there. The Hogsback Tunnel I mentioned earlier, that got demolished in the 1890s. The whole line was standard gauged in 1908. Passenger service ended in 1940, and Roaring Camp in 1985 bought the line. So just to jump back a little, this is the new section of track that they added north of Felton Junction, which is still used today by the Big Trees train. You can see the really deep fill, and then you can see the bridge. Most of that bridge is under fill now, just for those wondering. The only part that actually still exists is right kind of in the middle. You can see a thicker section. That's where the current truss bridge is built. And then you have over here, you have the new tunnel that was built, which at the time was called Tunnel 6. It was later promoted to Tunnel 5 when two of them were daylighted. And so this is the tunnel that bypassed the old track that went around this curve. This is one of the most beautiful things. Still there today. This is the hillside bridge that's at Coon Gulch. It replaced those old rugged bridges that were just kind of rough. And so this made sure that at least if a landslide happened, the track itself, the right-of-way, would stay intact. This fixed those problems pretty much permanently, although there are still sometimes landslides on the track. And then this is the Dinky, the Felton, being repurposed in Boulder Creek. After its long service with the Santa Cruz and Felton and some time away, it came back to work for the Santa Clara Valley Mill and Lumber Company, which had its mill at Doherty's about, I think it's 4 miles north of Boulder Creek. And so it shuttled lumber back and forth on this little private line. And so here it is in Boulder Creek getting re-oiled, it looks like. And then, yeah, just to kind of conclude this is 2 photos showing roughly the same location, not the same angle, unfortunately. But this on the right, you have Al Smith, Roaring Camp, or Santa Cruz Big Trees and Pacific, number 2600, crossing Highway 9. And on the left, you see the same crossing. You can even see a wagon off in the distance. It still exists. This line is still used all the time. Roaring Camp bought the line after the 1982 storms. They rehabilitated it and started running their Big Trees train. I think 86 was their first revenue train, and 87 is the first one that went to the boardwalk. And yeah, and you can still ride that today, which is great, because how many railroads are 150 years old that you can still ride most of the original right-of-way? That's only the Felton mile that's pretty much changed since then. And yeah, that is everything. So thank you for enjoying this talk.